I was just trying to count the superlatives there from Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary. You mentioned the word incredible, vaunting the values as the Trump administration sees it of what US military officials are describing as an unprecedented kind of attack. The first time that B-2 stealth fighters were using a particular bomb, that one of the heaviest bombs in the US arsenal. It weighs some 13,000 kilograms, and the US dropped 14 of them across those 3 contested nuclear sites in Iran. The US saying this was the first time that those kinds of munitions had been used in combat. So talking about the historic element to all of this, which is at variance with what some allies are saying about the effectiveness of that strike, and even Democrat lawmakers, opposition lawmakers here in the United States, questioning just to what extent the US has, in Donald Trump's word, the US president, obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. That is yet to be determined by experts, despite the Trump administration celebrating what they see as this very effective strike against Iran's nuclear targets.
Owen, let's focus on this notion from US Vice President J.D. Vance. He says US is not at war with Iran, but at war with Iran's nuclear program. Very novel logic there. Did he actually explain the context and the logic of his notion?
Yeah, it's certainly a message that the Trump administration have been putting out. We mentioned that Pentagon briefing earlier this Sunday where Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was talking. Dan Kane, the top soldier in the US Army, he's the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Command, made similar points, saying the US, this was a targeted strike with certain limitations. It was not targeting the Iranian people, not targeting the Iranian military. And as we've seen and heard in our last report there, that conflict with Iran goes on with each side, Israel and Iran, trading missile strikes by night and indeed through the day as well. The Trump administration has been making similar sounds to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, repeating over and over that their conflict is with the Iranian leadership. And of course, that's aimed to destabilize the Iranian leadership to some extent, to make people in Iran consider whether at this weakened moment for the country, they want to continue with the kind of administration they have. So it's not surprising to hear messages from the Trump administration mirroring those from Benjamin Netanyahu. J.D. Vance, the US president, you mentioned there, appealing there and suggesting that, in the words of the US, it's highly contested phrase, regime change, some kind of regime change in Iran might be on the table, but that's much more difficult to determine at this stage.
Still focusing on the heightened narrative from the Trump administration, President Donald Trump himself has hinted at regime change in Iran and also said monumental damage was caused by US strikes. Provide us more context of those statements.
Yeah, they all seem to be singing from the same hymn sheet, the Trump administration, during that early morning Pentagon briefing on Sunday in Washington, D.C. time, only to be potentially contradicted by US President Donald Trump himself. Indeed, Dan Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs that I mentioned, he said specifically during that Pentagon briefing that the US was not aiming for regime change, only to have Donald Trump very typically weigh in on his social media platform, Truth Social, and musing on this idea of regime change. It isn't clear exactly what he meant. He was being somewhat cryptic, saying, well, why not? This might be a good idea. And yet is also trying to put on the table the idea of some kind of negotiated diplomatic settlement that, in his view, would see Iran restraining its nuclear development program. And yet we know from the Iranian leadership, the Iranian foreign minister was quick to say that the time for diplomacy, in his words, is long past. So it's difficult to parse exactly what Donald Trump means from that single posting, but for sure we're going to find out a little bit more, and questions will be asked about the US's intentions in the days to come. Does it want some kind of regime change in Iran, or will it stick to what it thinks was a very targeted strike with certain perimeters, not targeting the Iranian people, not targeting the Iranian military? There are lots of questions about exactly what Washington wants to do and how it intends to go forward.
Well, Owen, I think it's fair to say that now the whole world is studying latest satellite photos on the US bombed sites in Iran, and there have been conflicting reports on the actual damage the US strikes caused. Bring us up to date, or help us to break down the confusion so far.
You're right. Of course, we had those satellite images of what some of those sites looked like before and after the strikes. But you're right. These are the details. Remember, the whole premise of the attack and using this particular type of what's called a bunker buster bomb was to penetrate Iran's uranium enrichment facilities that are buried deep underground in some of these three key sites. That the US targeted. That was why this mission was authorized unilaterally by Donald Trump to use this specific jet fighter that can travel vast distances, halfway around the world also, and carry these very heavy bombs. That was the premise for this operation. Israel, it should be noted, just doesn't have this kind of military equipment, so couldn't have launched that strike on its own. But of course, we're hearing reports that potentially in one of the uranium enrichment sites, it was maybe ventilator shafts that were targeted. But of course, that isn't clear in itself exactly how much damage has been done. It's interesting to note that opposition Democrat lawmakers here, one of them who's the ranking member on the Republican-led Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, was questioning how effective these strikes could have been and speculating on whether Iranian authorities might have had time. Given that in hindsight we saw warnings about this strike in previous days, did the Iranian leadership effectively manage to move enriched uranium to other sites? These are important questions, difficult to determine right now because, of course, there's no dialogue with the Iranian leadership officially, certainly about the specifics of its nuclear program.
Owen, let's go to domestic US. Anti-war protests have taken place in some cities across the country. Bring us up to date on the American people's voice.
We saw demonstrations sporadically across the United States, here on Sunday in Washington, D.C., as people woke up, or not perhaps woke up. These strikes took place at around 7 p.m. On Saturday evening, so people did have time to absorb that and consider how they're going to respond. And we saw sporadic demonstrations in places like New York, big cities like Chicago and so on. But I can tell you that on Monday there are protests planned, anti-war protests planned at around 24 US cities, including Washington, D.C., right outside the White House, where Donald Trump, around 36 hours or so earlier in the Situation Room of the White House, authorized this unilateral missile strike or bombing on Iran. So there's plenty of protests planned just in the US alone, and I dare say there will be protests around the world as well from people who are unhappy about the action that the US has taken.